Hi, sixth graders, continuing in Unit 9. We are still on our applying percents unit. Our topic is figuring out and learning percent equation and percent proportion. So we already know how to find the percent of a number. That was our last lesson, if you can think all the way back to that. And if we were given 20% of 50, we learned that we can do x equals, and then we change our percent to a decimal, 0.20 times 50 to solve what 20% of 50 is. Or, which we didn't talk about in our last video, but I'm just going to show you that we can always set it up as a proportion as well. So if I want to know what part, like what 20% of 50 is, I know that some number out of 50 is the same as 20 over 100 because 20%, remember, is 20 out of 100. So basically, we're just figuring out what number is going to make it the same as 20%. So we can set it up. This would be setting it up as a proportion. This would be setting it up as an equation. If you wrote this down, great. Otherwise, it's fine if you didn't because we're going to continue to write more things down as we go on. So I just wanted to show you that we already kind of know what we're about to be learning. It is a little bit confusing, so stay calm and stay patient and take as many notes as you can to help it make sense. So the first thing that we are going to learn is percent proportion. So I'm going to teach you two different methods of solving these percent problems, and then at the end of this video you can decide which one you like better, if you want to go with the proportion or if you want to go with the equation. But you need to watch it all and try both methods in order to see what you like the best. So please write percent proportion down on your notebook and write this inside this red box right here. We have is over of equals percent over 100, which is the same as part over whole, and then percent over 100. So a percent proportion compares part of a quantity to a whole quantity for one ratio and lists the percent as a number over 100 for the other ratio. So a proportion, we have two ratios that makes a proportion. Remember, proportions are two ratios that are equal to each other. If you would like to write this down or maybe come back after and write it down, you could. These are examples of the types of percent problems that we are going to see, and it would help you figure out how to set up your proportion. This might be something to come back and write after the video if you're still confused. All right, so 3 problems that we're going to do together, and then 3 problems with the other method that we're going to do together, and then you're going to try some on your own. So here's our percent proportion again that we're going to use for every single problem. So what percent of $24 is $18? I want you to write that down. We are trying to figure out what percent. So if we take a percent of 24, we want to get 18. So our is and our of over here in our proportion, and we wrote it as part and whole. Okay, so the number, like the part, is the number that goes along with the is. So is usually going to be before or after the part, or the part of the whole that we're trying to figure out. And then the of is going to be either before or after the whole. So this is how we're going to set it up. The first thing I do when I set up a proportion is I draw my ratio lines for my fraction, and I know they have to equal each other. The easiest part for me is to solve the percent side, or to not solve it, to fill in the percent side. It always is going to be over 100. So my proportion always, the bottom of one of the ratios always has 100. I'm not given a percent, so that's my variable. So now I figure out which is my whole and which is my part. Well, I'm taking the percent of 24 so that goes on the bottom. And I know that whatever the percent is has to equal 18. So the whole, meaning the number that I'm taking the percent of, and then the part is the number that after I take the percent, that's what I end up with. And then we solve. And if you think back to solving proportions, remember we just multiply diagonally. I find the two numbers that have numbers diagonal from each other and then divide by the third. So 100 times 18 and then divide it by 24. And I'm for surely going to use my calculator for these to help speed it up just a little bit. 100 times 18 divided by 24 is 75. It's asking me what percent, so that means I have to add a percent sign. All right, next one. What number is 60% of 150? So I'm going to set up my ratios, my proportion, and make them equal. Right away, I know I'm going to have a 100 on the bottom. And now I'm given 60%, so 60 out of 100, because the percent is always over 100. That's the first one I always set up, like I said, because that one's pretty easy. Then I ask myself, what am I taking a percent of? Well, I'm taking a percent of 150, so that's going to go on the bottom, and I don't know what it's going to equal. Now I can multiply, so this time I'm going to do 150 times 60. And then I'm going to divide by 100, and I get x equals 90. And we always want to make sure it makes sense. So 60% of 150, well, I know 50% of 150 is 75. 60% is a little bit greater than 50. 90 is a little bit greater than 75. So it makes sense. And then we have 13 is 26% of what number? So again, here's my two ratios, my proportion to make it equal. 26%, so let's do 26 over 100. This time I'm taking 26% of something that I don't know. So that's on the bottom, and then 13 is on the top. And now I solve, and I do 100 times 13, and I divide it by 26, and I get 50. So 26% of 50 equals 13. That is percent proportion. Now we're going to do percent equation. Percent equation. I don't know why it's not letting me write here. But please write down percent equation on your notebook. And then here's our equation right here. Part equals percent times whole. And then after you write that down and like square it, our equal sign is our is, and our multiplication is of. And we'll talk about that next. If you want to write this table down, it again has some types of problems with the way that you would solve it as an equation. This should say equation, which I just noticed this. And yes, let's do some problems together. So using the equation method, example 1, 600 is what percent of 750? So we have, I'm going to write it up here, part equals percent times whole. Again, our is usually around the part, and the of is usually around the whole. So 600 equals, there's our is, which is equals, what percent, we don't know what percent, of is multiplication 750. So if we think back to finding the percent of a number, remember we take the percent, we multiply it times the whole, or multiply it whatever times we're trying to figure out what a percent of something is. It's just that this time we're missing a part of the equation. So now if we think back to solving one-step equations, and we can do our railroad tracks, and then we can see that if I divide both sides by 750, that would cancel out, and I have x alone. So then I do 600 divided by 750, and I get 0.8. Now for the equation, we have to change it from a decimal to a percent. So now I just have one more step. I have to move it to the right 2. So then I get x equals 80%. And that's only because I was finding the percent. Here is our next example. 45 is 90% of what number? So 45 is, it's not always going to be written in this order, but my is tells me that it's my part, and my part goes on the other side of the equal sign. 45 equals, so now this time with my 90%, I can't just write 90, I have to change it to a decimal. So I have 0.90 times, and then of what number? We're not sure. So now we divide both sides by 0.90 this time, because again, we want x alone. So I do 45 divided by 0.90, which is 50. And remember, if you divide by something less than 1, you're going to get a number greater. And that makes sense that my number is 50, because if I'm taking 90% of 50, then it makes sense I should get 45. This time I just leave it alone because I already changed my percent to a decimal, and my answer is the whole number, or like the whole of the number that I'm finding the percent of, so I don't have to change it. All right, last example for equation. What number is 30% of 70? So we have what number is, so we don't know what our part is going to be. We know 30%, so we change it to 0.30, and then we multiply it times 70 because I'm taking 30% of 70. Here I'm taking 90% of this number. Here I'm taking X percent of 750. So that's how we think of it when we set it up in the equation. So then we can solve, and we would do, this time, X is already alone. So I don't have to do anything. I just basically have to multiply them together. So for this one, I do 0.30 times 70, and I get 21. One thing I want to add is that the whole is not always going to be greater than the part. If I was going to do like, what number is 150% of 5? The way that I would set it up for my proportion or my equation, I guess for my proportion, remember if we think back, we have the percent over 100. Even though it's greater than 100, it's still going to be over 100. So this problem, actually, now that I'm just doing this on the fly, would be a great one for you to write down in your notebook. So I set it up 150 over 100. And then what number is 150% of 5? So 5 is going to go here. X would go here. And then I would solve it, and I would go 150 times 5 divided by 100 is 7.5. So sometimes, or I just want to do one other really quick. And if we go back really quick to this, just to set it up as a percent equation. So what number is, it would be X equals, and then here I'm going to change that to a decimal, which would be 1.5 times 5. and then we would solve it. 1.5 times 5 would be 7.5. All right, example, like let's say we have 10 is what percent of 5, then we want, and we set up the proportion method, and we go, yep, we don't have a percent, so it goes over 100. Well, then we just think that we automatically put the higher number below, but really it's 10 is what percent of 5. So the of 5 would go here, the 10 would go here, and then I know that my x would be a percent higher than 100 because I'm going from 5 to 10. So I just want to clarify that this top number here is not always going to be the smaller number, and this bottom number is not always going to be the larger number. So I would like you to, in your notebook, try these problems. It would be best if you did all 6 of them. You can do whichever method you want. There's 2 of each type of problem, and maybe you do half with the proportion and half with the equation, or maybe there is one method that totally makes sense to you and the other one is super confusing, so just use the one method, or or the other method, whatever you want to do. When you're done, so pause this and do all these, and then when you're done, unpause me, and you will come to this screen, which I have already wrote out both methods. So you can see, like number 1, I have the proportion method here, the equation method here. And then check your work. And if you got the answer wrong, look at my work and see, maybe you set it up wrong, maybe you multiplied wrong, see where your mistakes are, and then go back and try it again. So there's 1 through 3, and there's 4 through 6. So pause it, take your time. It would be to your best benefit to try to set this up. I don't care which method you use as long as you find one that works, and really maybe go rewatch me going through the proportion, or maybe just rewatch me going through the equations, or maybe you want to listen to Miss Kraska or Miss Lobbs go through one of the methods and see if they explain it a little bit differently. All right, and then we have one last problem. A survey found that 25% of people age 18 to 24 gave up their home phone and only use a cell phone. If 3,264 people only use a cell phone, how many people were surveyed? So we have 25%, and they took 25% of people age 18 through 20, which we do not know. So 25% of, I'm just going to say X, equals 3,264. I'm going to set it up both ways. The proportion method, I would set it up like this. 3,264 over X equals 25 over 100. To set it up the equation, it would be 3,264 equals 0.25 times X. Notice, remember, the proportion method, I keep it my percent over 100. The equation method, I change it to a decimal. And now I can solve it both ways with my proportion. I'm going to do 3,264 times 100 divided by 25. And I get 13,056 people were surveyed. And then if I do the same over here, 3,264 divided by 0.25, I would also get 13,056 people were surveyed. All right, have a great day.